They say the rafters of an old Kentucky barn bend with more than age. They bend with memory. The wood, blackened by rain and warped by years, creaks even on windless nights, as though the building itself breathes. To wander near it after sundown is to feel watched, though no eyes meet your own. Farmers, hunters, and drifters who've passed its leaning frame all tell the same tale, each voice trembling in firelight. That if you listen closely, with your ear pressed to the timber, you will hear it. A sound not of wind or insects, but something sharper, deliberate, the slow rasp of steel against wood, a knife being drawn over and over, as though forever sharpening for a task unfinished. They call the presence within those walls the shade. Some say ghost, some say curse, but all agree it is not fully of this world. He waits, they whisper, crouched in rafters where shadows never lift, his breath mingling with dust, his eyes glowing like coals buried in ash. No one speaks his true name aloud, though once he was known as Elijah. That name has long since been swallowed by silence, buried beneath chains, cruelty, and blood. In life, he was not a legend. He was a man bent beneath a master's hand, forced into labor until his back carried scars deeper than any plow could carve into soil. But time and silence hardened him, until what remained was no longer just man, but story. The barn holds that story still. On nights when the moon climbs pale and high, children dare each other to step inside. Few make it past the door, for within, the air is too heavy, too still, as if it carries the weight of unseen eyes. Those who linger swear they hear it, that whispering scrape, steel against wood, measured, patient. And some claim, if they do not flee, they catch a glimpse of movement above, a dark shape perched between the beams, as though waiting for the world to step wrong. But what most forget or refuse to recall is that before Elijah was shade, before his knife carved memory into legend, there was silence. A silence more haunting than any whisper of steel. He learned it young, when words brought punishment, when cries brought the whip. The silence of swallowed pain, of chains rattling in the night with no answer, of hunger endured because begging was useless. It grew inside him, not as weakness, but as something heavy, patient, enduring. He became fluent in silence the way others are fluent in speech. The rafters know. They lean low, as though listening to secrets never spoken, as though straining to hold a weight heavier than what should bear. For they alone heard his breathing in the long nights when Elijah lay below, staring upward with eyes that refused to close. They alone felt the tremor of his hand, sliding steel against stone, shaping his silence into a blade. The barn became his chapel, his witness, his graveyard of unspoken oaths. And so the whispers endure. Parents hush their children when the wind moans across the fields, warning them never to enter the barn after dark. Old men shake their heads when travelers scoff, muttering that some shadows are best left undisturbed. For Elijah's silence is not past. It lingers alive, sharpened. On the darkest nights, when stars vanish and the sky hangs low, the barn groans like an old man stirring from restless sleep. The doors sway, the beams creak, and the sound returns, steel dragging slow across wood, again and again. A knife, a breath, a waiting. And those who hear it swear the silence afterward is worse than the sound itself. Heavy as chains, final as death. They say the shade is still there. They say Elijah never left. The story of Elijah begins not with firelight or whispers, but with the sound of chains. Heavy, cold iron against bone, a sound that no child should learn too young, yet he did. Born beneath a sky that held no mercy, Elijah's first memories were of the field, of soil packed under bare feet, of a sun that did not forgive, of hands blistered before they ever learned to write. There are no birth dates in chains, no birthdays marked on calendars. Only seasons, the season of planting, the season of harvest, the season of the whip. His mother had been taken when he was still small enough to cling to her skirts. The day she was sold, Elijah did not cry, for he had already learned what crying bought. A whip's crack, the cold laughter of men who owned nothing of pain, but took everything of it from others. He remembered only her hand brushing the side of his face one last time, the hush of her voice telling him, "Be still. Survive." Then she was gone, her figure swallowed by dust and distance. From that day, Elijah carried silence like inheritance. The silence of a boy who dared not speak unless ordered. The silence of a youth whose laughter was beaten out of him before it could take root. They said he was stubborn, that he held his eyes too high, and for every glance too bold, for every second too slow to obey, the lash carved its lesson into his back. The scars it left were more than skin deep. They formed a map across his body, a script written in pain. Each welt hardened, darkened, until his very flesh seemed to remember the cruelty of men who wielded power as casually as they wielded a cane or a gun. Elijah wore his history on his skin, but he never spoke of it. He carried it, buried it, let it ferment inside until silence became sharper than words. The barn, even then, was no stranger to him. It was where he slept on nights too bitter for the shacks, pressed against cold wood, rats scurrying nearby. It was where the lash sometimes fell, its walls echoing with screams that faded to silence. The rafters above had watched him from boyhood, watched as he bent beneath burdens meant to break grown men, watched his hunger carve his frame thinner each year. The rafters listened as he whispered to himself in the dark, not prayers, for Elijah had learned early that heaven did not hear, but oaths, quiet promises of survival, of patience, of something unnamed that stirred but could not yet awaken. There were others, of course. Children born beside him, voices that once joined his in laughter before punishment silenced them too. Many were sold. Some died young, bones buried shallow in unmarked soil. Elijah did not forget them, though he did not speak their names aloud. They lived in his silence, carried in the weight of his stare, in the clenched jaw he offered to the whip. His master, a man swollen with arrogance and liquor, called Elijah mute, though he was not. He mocked the boy's silence, struck him harder for refusing to beg. Yet in that refusal lay strength. In chains, silence became a weapon, one the master could not steal. For every lash, Elijah offered no cry. For every insult, no answer. For every cruelty, no plea. The silence became defiance, a shadow forming where flesh could not fight. And so the scars grew, not only on his back, but in his spirit. Each one deepened a shade inside him, until the boy named Elijah began to fade, replaced by something colder, darker. A patience that was not surrender, but waiting. The barn remembers. Its timbers absorbed the blood. Its beams listened to the breathing of a boy learning to turn pain into silence. The rafters bent low, as if evenwood could pity the weight that human hearts would not. And when the wind passes through that barn today, some swear it moans with the voices of those children lost, their echoes braided with Elijah's scars, calling not for pity, but for remembrance. For the shade was born not in the strike of a blade, nor the act of vengeance that would one day come, but in these years of silence, of scars carved deeper than flesh. And though Elijah did not yet know it, every lash was sharpening him. Every silence was shaping him, until one day, silence itself would cut. The winter that year was crueler than most. The fields froze to stone, the air itself cut like knives, and every breath from the lungs turned to pale smoke that vanished as quickly as hope. In those nights, the quarters shook with wind, their broken boards letting in more cold than they kept out. Hunger had hollowed the men and women until they seemed less alive than shadows, their ribs sharp beneath their skin, their eyes dim, candles fighting not to be blown out. Elijah worked through it all, silent as ever, his body already too accustomed to pain to waste breath on groans. Yet even silence felt heavier in that cold, like chains of ice dragging against his chest. On one such night, when the barn was colder than the grave and frost clung to the rafters like white ash, a sound broke the silence, small, hesitant footsteps on wooden boards. Elijah, half curled in the dark, raised his head. From a narrow crack of the barn door, a face appeared. A child, her cheeks red with wind, her hair tangled, eyes too large for her small frame. She was not of his world of chains and orders, not yet hardened by cruelty. She belonged to the house, to the family that claimed to own his life. In her hands, trembling, she held something so small it might have been overlooked, a crust of bread. Not fresh, not warm, only the brittle end of a loaf long gone stale. But to Elijah, it looked like a miracle. The child looked at him, and in her wide, uncertain gaze there was something rare, something almost forgotten, pity. She stepped closer, breath fogging in the frozen air. Her small fingers extended the crust toward him. No words, no explanations, only that offering. Elijah's hand, scarred and rough as bark, reached out slowly, as though afraid the simple gift would vanish if he moved too quickly. Their fingers brushed for an instant, hers soft, his calloused, and something long buried stirred within him. For a heartbeat, Elijah almost smiled. Not a broad smile, not a soundless laugh, but the faintest crack in his iron silence. That crumb of bread was not food, it was proof. Proof that even in a house of wolves, some ember of kindness could still glow. Proof that the world had not entirely forgotten mercy. But mercy in such a place was always fragile. The barn door slammed open with a force that rattled its hinges. A man's voice roared through the cold. Her father. Drunk with anger, red with fury, he dragged the child back by her arm. The bread fell into the straw, trampled underfoot as though it had never mattered. His hand struck her cheek, a sharp, echoing crack that froze Elijah where he sat. The child cried out, not from the pain alone, but from the shame of being punished for a kindness too pure for this world. Elijah did not move. He did not speak. His silence, as always, was his armor. But something new had carved itself into that silence, a seed. He watched as the father's hand pulled the child away, watched the door slam shut again, leaving only the fading echo of her sobs behind. The barn was silent once more, yet that silence was no longer only chains and scars. It carried the ghost of a kindness too fleeting to last. The crust of bread lay broken in the straw, trampled, unworthy in the eyes of the man who had struck it down. Elijah picked it up anyway, holding it in his palm as though it were treasure. He ate it slowly, each dry, tasteless bite swallowed with reverence, not for the bread itself, but for what it had meant. For a moment, humanity had touched him, and though it was torn away, though cruelty had crushed it, that fleeting mercy lingered in his chest like an ember refusing to die. He knew then, as he would know for the rest of his days, that kindness was not absent from the world, only hunted, beaten, driven into silence. And if kindness could not survive here, then silence must become something else, something sharper, something that would cut through the cruelty like a blade through flesh. The rafters above groaned as if bearing witness, their beams bending not with age, but with memory. In their creaking, Elijah almost heard the echo of the child's small gesture, a whisper reminding him that shadows could still hold traces of light. Yet as the wind howled through the barn and the cold pressed harder against his bones, he understood. Kindness was fragile, too fragile to endure. And when it breaks, it leaves only silence sharpened to steel. The nights grew longer, stretching thin like old rope ready to snap. Winter loosened its grip, but no warmth followed. The air carried only dampness, the heavy scent of rot, and the stale dust of barns that had known too many secrets. Elijah's silence grew heavier with each passing dusk. It clung to him like a shroud, unnerving to those who watched him. The other enslaved men whispered of him in hushed tones, calling him ghost, shadow, shade. Even the master, drunk with arrogance, sometimes paused when Elijah's dark eyes lingered too long, as if the silence itself were daring him. Mistrust thickened like smoke in a room with no windows. Every step Elijah took seemed measured, too deliberate, as if each movement carried intention hidden from sight. Overseers began watching him more closely, their suspicion sharpened by his refusal to break, to beg, to scream. They wanted cracks, signs of weakness they could exploit. But Elijah gave them nothing. His silence unnerved them more than defiance ever could. It was in the barn, away from prying eyes, that his silence began to change form. There, among straw and dust, beneath rafters groaning with memory, he worked with patience older than stone. He had scavenged a fragment of iron once discarded, useless to those who had cast it aside. To Elijah, it was not useless. It was potential. Each night, while the quarters slept and the master dreamed his cruel dreams, Elijah pressed that fragment against stone. Slow, careful, steel grinding against grit until the edge caught moonlight. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, the rasp of metal against stone, the whisper of something being born in secret. If you pressed your ear to the barn wall on such nights, you might have heard it. That sound, layered with his breath, steady and calm, became the pulse of the growing shadows. The rafters leaned close, like ribs enclosing him, as if the barn itself conspired to shield his secret. The silence was no longer chains. It was sharpening. Others noticed. A boy who carried buckets past the barn swore he saw sparks flicker through the cracks. An old woman, too tired to fear much anymore, claimed she heard the rafters groan differently at night, as though they too were waiting. Rumors crawled through the quarters, stitched together by fear and awe. Elijah was making something. Elijah was planning something. He was no longer only a man. He was becoming a story in the making. The master, blind in his cruelty, did not see it. He thought the silence meant submission, that broken backs and stolen children had hollowed Elijah into emptiness. He could not fathom that silence itself might be an anvil, and on it, vengeance was being forged. Each day, Elijah endured the whip, endured the chains, endured the laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. But at night, in the shadows of the barn, he became more than endurance. He became patience weaponized. The knife grew sharper with every stroke. His resolve hardened with every humiliation. His silence deepened until it was hard to tell where the man ended and the legend began. There were moments, fleeting and terrible, when Elijah would stop his grinding, his hand frozen mid-motion, and listen to the rafters above. The beams creaked and sighed like tired bones, and he almost believed they whispered to him, urging him to continue, telling him the time was near. The shadows in the barn thickened. They clung to Elijah's skin, wrapped around his scarred back, sank into the steel in his hand. He no longer belonged fully to the world of men. He was crossing into something else, something that could not be whipped, chained, or broken. And though no one yet knew what form it would take, all felt its weight. The silence was no longer still. It was a storm gathering beneath the rafters, waiting for the night when thunder would break. The dusk bled red that evening. The skies split with streaks of fire, as though the heavens themselves carried wounds they could not hide. The fields, long since harvested, lay bare under the dying light, their emptiness echoing the hunger in the quarters. Elijah stood among the others, his silence heavy as ever, watching the shadows lengthen across the dirt. But it was not the sunset that would be remembered that night. It was what followed, what cruelty chose to reveal when the light gave way to dark. An old woman, stooped with years of toil, had faltered in her work. Her hands, twisted by time, no longer obeyed the demands of the lash. She had been a mother once, her children sold away until even their names had been swallowed by distance. Now she was little more than a husk, skin stretched thin over bone, her breath a fragile thread holding her to the earth. She bent to lift a bundle too heavy, staggered, and fell to her knees. The world should have shown mercy in that moment. But mercy had no place here. The master came, whip coiled in his hand like a serpent eager to strike. His face was flushed with rage, not at the work undone, but the audacity of frailty itself. He bellowed, each word drenched in scorn, and brought the whip down across her back. Once, twice, again. The sound split the dusk like cracks of lightning, each strike tearing flesh, each cry swallowed before it could fully escape. She did not scream. She only crumpled further, her body folding in on itself, as though the earth were already calling her back. Elijah watched. His silence, long his armor, long his shield, trembled at the edges. Every scar on his back seemed to burn anew, each lash striking not only the frail woman, but the boy he once was, the man he had become. His hands clenched until his knuckles whitened, veins thick like ropes beneath his skin. Around him, others bowed their heads, some out of fear, others out of resignation. But Elijah could not lower his gaze. His eyes locked on the sight. Cruelty against weakness, power against dust. Something split within him. A fissure carved open by years of betrayal and loss widened into a chasm that could no longer contain what it held. Silence, once his refuge, became unbearable. It pressed against his chest, choking, smothering, demanding release. He felt it rise like a tide, black and furious, surging against the dam he had built from endurance and restraint. For years he had buried it, the rage, the grief, the endless hunger for justice. But now, under the crimson sky, with the old woman crumpled in the dirt, silence could no longer bind him. That night, when darkness gathered and the quarters fell still, Elijah did not retreat into his silence as he had so many times before. Instead, he sought the barn. The rafters greeted him with their familiar groans, beams sagging under memory's weight. He lit no lantern. The moonlight was enough. In his hand, the knife gleamed, sharper than it had ever been. He ran his thumb along the edge, and it bit his skin, drawing a bead of blood. He did not flinch. He welcomed it. For blood was the language the master spoke, and Elijah was ready to answer. Standing beneath the rafters, he swore a vow, not in words, but in the steady set of his jaw, the unyielding weight of his silence. The master's cruelty would not pass unanswered. Every lash, every betrayal, every stolen kindness had sharpened him into this moment. He was no longer only a man. He was the storm the rafters had waited for, the silence forged into steel. When he set the knife back into the straw, its blade caught the moonlight like a sliver of judgment. Elijah lifted his gaze to the dark beams above and felt, for the first time, that the barn itself leaned in closer, listening, waiting. The breaking point had come, and from that night forward, silence would not protect him. Silence would speak in blood. The night of reckoning came with a storm. The sky, swollen and black, pressed low over the land, groaning with thunder that rattled the ribs of the barn. Rain lashed the earth in jagged sheets, drumming against the roof like the march of countless feet. The quarters huddled silent in fear, their prayers drowned by the storm's fury. But Elijah was not among them. He was in the barn, where the rafters leaned close, where shadows gathered thick as breath. The knife gleamed in his hand, its edge hungry, patient. He had waited long enough. The master stumbled across the yard, drunk not only on whiskey, but on power. His voice cut through the storm, a slurred roar calling for his shadow. He carried his whip, coiled and ready, as though the serpent had grown restless. Each step he took was heavy, arrogant, blind. He believed the world bent beneath him as it always had. He believed no silence could rise against him. He did not know the rafters had been waiting too. The barn door flew open with a violent crack, slamming against the wall as wind and rain surged inside. The master stood framed in the doorway, lightning etching his form in white fire. His eyes found Elijah in the dark, the figure waiting, still as stone. For a moment, the master sneered, mistaking patience for submission. His whip uncoiled with a hiss, its tail snapping against the floor. "Elijah," he spat, the name heavy with disdain. "Come forward, shadow. Time you learned your place again." But Elijah did not move. His silence filled the barn, louder than thunder, heavier than rain. The master's sneer faltered, irritation twisting into anger. He raised the whip high, the serpent ready to strike. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the steel in Elijah's hand. The whip cracked, a sound Elijah had known since boyhood, a sound that had carved itself into his very skin. But this time, another sound answered, steel splitting air, a whisper turned scream. Elijah moved with the certainty of a storm breaking, his arms steady, his silence sharpened to a single stroke. The knife found flesh. The master staggered, his face a mask of shock, disbelief flooding his eyes. He looked down as though the crimson blooming across his chest was some impossible trick, some betrayal of nature itself. His whip fell from his hand, useless now, its serpent slain. Blood poured into the straw, staining it dark, soaking the earth that had long borne witness to cruelty. The barn groaned, rafters creaking as though they too exhaled after years of waiting. The storm outside howled, lightning striking close, thunder rolling through the beams like drums of judgment. The master fell to his knees, his breath rattling, his hands clutching at the wound as though he might stuff his life back inside. But his power, his laughter, his chains, they all bled out with him. Elijah stood over him, the knife dripping, his face unreadable, his silence unbroken. In that moment, he was no longer flesh alone. He was vengeance given form, silence sharpened, legend ignited. He had become what whispers would never forget, the shade of Kentucky. The master's final breath left him with a gurgle, his eyes frozen wide, not with fear, but with astonishment that the silence he had mocked, the shadow he had beaten, had risen to strike him down. He collapsed into the straw, lifeless, his blood seeping into the barn's bones. Elijah did not linger. He did not scream triumph, did not weep. He turned from a body and walked into the storm, the barn groaning behind him as though closing a chapter in its long memory. The rafters, sagging with age, would never forget. The knife, slick with blood, was no longer just steel, it was a story. And in that storm, under a sky torn open by lightning, Elijah vanished. The master was dead. The shade was born. Dawn came reluctantly, gray and swollen, as if the heavens themselves dreaded the light it would cast upon the earth. The storm had passed, but its ruin lingered, broken branches strewn across the fields, puddles swelling with mud, the air heavy with the scent of rain and blood. The barn stood crooked, its timbers dark with moisture, its rafters sagging as though exhausted from what they had borne through the night. The master's body lay in the straw, stiff and pale, eyes frozen wide as if still questioning what had dared rise against him. The crimson around him had dried to black, staining the hay like ink spilled from a broken story. His whip lay coiled near his hand, useless, its serpent's tongue stilled forever. It was a boy who found him first, sent by his mother to fetch wood. He pushed the barn door open, yawning, expecting only dust and shadow. Instead, he froze. His small cry broke the morning silence, piercing it like glass. By the time his voice carried to the quarters, the whispers had already begun. Men and women crept toward the barn, careful as prey stepping into a predator's den. Some refused to enter, crossing themselves, muttering prayers, for they already knew what waited within. Others, braver or more desperate, stepped across the threshold. They saw the body slumped in straw, saw the eyes wide with disbelief, saw the blood pooled deep. Their breath caught, their hands trembled, but beneath their fear lay something else, awe. Elijah, someone whispered, the name trembling, half prayer, half curse. Another voice answered in hushed tones, not Elijah, not anymore. The shade. They said he had vanished in the night, swallowed by storm and trees. Some claimed they saw his figure moving toward the forest, lightning carving his outline before he disappeared into mist. Others swore he dissolved into the storm itself, that thunder had carried him away, leaving only silence and blood behind. None could say for certain. What they knew was this: the master was dead, and Elijah was gone. The mistress of the house wailed when she saw the body, her cries twisting through the morning air, high and hollow. Overseers rode out, scouring the land, their dogs straining against leashes, sniffing for the scent of blood and steel. They found nothing. No trail, no body, no shadow. The forest held its secrets tight, refusing to betray the man who had spilled his chains. In the quarters, Fear and wonder mingled like smoke. Mothers pulled children close, whispering warnings not to speak his name too loudly. For names gave life, and life had already turned him into something greater than flesh. Old men nodded slowly, eyes glinting, as if they had always known silence would one day rise to strike. At night, some swore the barn groaned louder than before, its rafters creaking like laughter or perhaps mourning. A young girl claimed she saw the knife gleaming beneath the hay, still dripping red though days had passed. Others shook their heads, insisting no weapon remained, only the market left carved into the marrow of the land. The master's burial was quiet, unmarked by reverence. The earth closed over him without ceremony, without forgiveness. His absence, once unthinkable, became a wound across the plantation, a wound not of grief, but of fear. If the shade could rise from silence once, who could say he would not return? By the end of that week, his name was no longer spoken in daylight. Instead, the whispers grew at night, low and trembling, slipping through the walls of cabins, drifting across the fields. They said the shade was watching. They said he was waiting. They said the rafters had kept his secret, and that every barn in Kentucky leaned just slightly heavier because of it. The quarters did not sing that week. They did not dare. But when the wind moaned through the trees and the barn groaned under moonlight, some swore they could hear it, the slow rasp of steel against wood, a breath in the dark, awaiting. The master was gone, but Elijah's silence lived on, sharper than any blade. The years did not wash the blood from the barn. The timbers were scrubbed, the hay was burned, but still, on nights when the storm returned, the rafters wept dark stains down their beams, as if the sky itself remembered. New masters came, new crops rose, new seasons passed, but Elijah's absence never loosened its grip. His silence had carved itself into the marrow of the land, heavier than chains, sharper than steel. Children born after the killing grew up on the whispers. They were told never to walk past the barn at night, for a shadow moved there, tall and silent, a knife glinting faintly in the dark. The elders, their voices roughened by years of fear, warned them, "If you hear the rafters groan, do not look inside. If you see a man standing where no man should, do not speak his name." Some swore Elijah never fled the plantation at all. They said his body was swallowed by the storm, that he slipped between lightning and rain into a place beyond reach, neither dead nor alive, but waiting. Others told a harsher tale, that he walked north in silence, carrying the knife in his hand until the blade grew black, leaving a trail of fear behind him from farm to farm, until masters locked their doors at night. And then there were those who said he became something more than man, less than ghost, a shape of vengeance that could not be chained. A Kentucky shade. Travelers passing through told of barns leaning strangely eastward, as if bending toward some unseen weight. Hunters spoke of nights when dogs refused to cross certain fields, tails tucked, eyes wide, growling at the emptiness. One overseer, drunk and bold, claimed he had stepped into the barn years after and found the whip hanging where no hand had placed it, coiled above him like a serpent, swaying though the air was still. He left the plantation that same night, muttering that Elijah's silence was heavier than a scream. The story seeped beyond Kentucky, carried by whispers, by firelight retellings, by the shiver in the spine of those who had once stood in the barn themselves. It was no longer Elijah alone they spoke of, but the shade, the legend of a man who endured, who broke, who struck, and who vanished. Parents whispered it as warning, rebels whispered it as promise. A tale that belonged to no one, yet clung to everyone who had ever bent under another's hand. And still the barn stood. Seasons rotted its boards, storms tore its roof, but it would not fall. It leaned, it sagged, it groaned, yet it stood, as though bound not by nails, but by memory. At night, when the wind carried across the fields, you could hear it breathe, a long sigh through broken planks, a sound like a man exhaling after holding his silence too long. Even now, some say the shade waits there, that on nights when thunder rolls, a figure moves in the corner of your eye, tall, silent, knife glinting faintly as the rafters shudder above. They say he watches, not with mercy, not with wrath, but with patience. For patience was the weapon he sharpened longest. And so, Elijah was never buried. Not truly. Not by earth, not by storm, not by time. He remains in the rafters, in the shadow of barns, in the silence that follows cruelty. He remains in the whispered warnings passed down through generations, in the tremor of men who hear groaning wood and think it just might be him. Some legends close like a book, their endings neat, their lessons sealed. This one does not. This one lingers, unresolved, haunting, sharp. It asks no forgiveness. It grants no peace. It leaves only silence, and in that silence, the shade. The Kentucky shade.